Genesis chapter 19 records one of the most disgusting and horrific events of the entire history of humanity. I'm not aware that it's happened. The movie was made by Hollywood of Genesis chapter 19. It would most likely be rated at least R. And it would be because of the violence and the sexual content in this chapter. It contains the depraved behaviour. For many of us, we read Genesis chapter 19 and we draw back. We're repulsed by what we read. We're repulsed by the sodomites. Perhaps by the vision of God's wrath in this chapter. Whole cities, whole communities, entire families and farms are consumed by the vengeance of God. We flinch when we read of this. At times in this chapter is repulsive. And perhaps we find ourselves shaking our heads at Lot's weakness and incompetence as a father and as a citizen. Things somehow we are strangely attracted to Genesis chapter 19. We're attracted to Sodom because in a way we can identify with Sodom. It reminds us of our own society, which, if you like, before the day of judgment. Jesus spoke about a Sodom-like society, of what it will be like before judgment. His words in the Gospel of Luke and chapter 17, Noah. He says in Luke 17 verse 28, likewise it will also be in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed? As we live in these last days, it's the night before the judgment. Our own country is increasingly... We live more and more in a Sodom-like society. We're drawn to Sodom because we can identify something with Sodom. We're drawn to Lot, surely, in this passage. As we've seen already in our studies, Lot was a weak believer. He was so easily influenced by the culture around him. And we know that that is us at times. We feel our weakness. And we know impotence and vulnerability to compromise, rather than living lives of principled obedience as we seek to exercise the muscle of faith. We live in Sodom, and far too often, Lot, this man who had allowed to develop in his life a pattern of compromise. Little compromises, compromises in important decisions in his life that placed him on the slippery slope of spiritual decline. In our Bibles at the commencement of Genesis 19, Lot reappears in Moses' narrative. He hasn't been around for a couple of chapters. He reappears here now in Genesis 19. In terms of a time frame, 15 years have passed since Lot was rescued by Uncle Atul back in the city of Sodom. That's what we looked at last time we were considering this character. When we find him in Genesis 19 verse 1, Lot has assimilated himself and his family into Sodomite society. Economically and socially, he's a Sodomite. Religiously, and yet he is a compromised man. He's like a dim light that's flickering in a dark place. Let's remember Peter's words. Remember Peter's words in 2 Peter chapter 2. He tells us that Lot is a saved man. We're glad just from these studies. But Peter makes it clear he is a saved man, that his soul is vexed by what is going on around him in that context. But that grief, it seems, was never deep enough to move him out of what would have to be one of the most cities in the history of humanity. Occasionally, the light of God's righteousness flickers in his life, and we see it. But overall, a pattern of compromise has placed him on a spiritual decline, and it ends him in a confusion. And today, friends, as we come to these first 11 verses of Genesis 19, that's what we're considering. Lot's crisis of confusion. And there are 3 things that I would like us to consider as we look at these verses. These will be the 3 headings. Firstly, the visiting, the calling voices. And then thirdly, the saving hand. And I've chosen such wording in those headings, a little bit peculiar, but I've chosen it to highlight something of the drama of this story. This chapter is filled to reflect this very fact. The visiting feet, action. The calling voices, action. The saving hand. It's an action-packed chapter. And as the story develops, the drama increases, the action, as it like, if you like, accelerates, and it's like as if we're on the edge of our seats when the story gets to it. We're watching this movie, as it were, unfold, and we're captivated, and our eyes are wide open as the whole thing comes to a crescendo. And yet it all begins with the visiting feet. So look with me now at Genesis chapter 19 and verse 1. The human author here writes this as he's directed by the Holy Spirit. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Moses identifies for us right up front that these visiting feet were angels' feet. He says they're men through the narrative, as he has previously in the previous chapter. But here, he makes it clear right up front that these feet are angels' feet. These are the very angels, plus another, who had already been to visit Abraham. 2 plus 1 other makes 3, naturally. From heaven to visit. If you look back in chapter 18, we'll just read a couple of verses there to get the context of that situation. Genesis 18, verse 20. They've been with Abraham. And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very great, that they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there, that's these 2 men, these 2 angels turned away from where they were with Abraham, and they went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood. And when these angels arrive in chapter 19, verse 1, when they arrive at Sodom, you can see there in the start of that verse, it's already evening. Possibly that's around sundown or dark. Let's remember, this is from the Hebrew culture. We saw evenings. One started about 3 and one started about 6. So the first evening as the sun is beginning to set. The second evening after it had gone down. We saw that some weeks back when we looked in Mark chapter 16 in relation to the burial of Christ. So here it seems it's the early part of evening. It's the late afternoon. They're still able to travel. They still have enough drive into Sodom. And as they approach the city, you see there that Moses tells us that Lot is sitting in a particular place. He's careful to tell us where he is seated. That may seem like a strange thing, but of course it's significant. Lot was sitting in the gates of Sodom. It's the usual place of business and commercial activity in those ancient cities, those ancient towns. Also, it was where judicial councils took place. It was the place to socialise. It was the place to transact business. And Moses tells us that's where Lot is. into life in Sodom. Remember, it's been 15 years since he resettled his family in this city after being rescued by his uncle. Perhaps by now, he's risen to some place of importance in this society. Maybe simply at the end of this day he was doing what he often did, signing off on some important business deal, because that's where business transactions often happened. Some have read into this scene that Lot was actually waiting at the gate to warn any visitors about how bad it was in Sodom. Reading on the situation that you can. For if he was so concerned about visitors coming into the city because of what the city was like, why did he keep living there? Why leave his family in such a gross place? Why have his single daughters in a city, his visitors' safety coming in? Why would he stay there if that was the reason? Well, whatever be the case, Moses tells us that Lot responds immediately when those visiting feet enter the city. What's his response? Well, it's in the second half of verse 1. When Lot saw them, he ran, bowed himself with his face toward the ground, and he said, "Here now, my lords, or sirs," an address of respect, "please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, the open square." But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house. Now let's grab, if you like, our remote control and hit pause. This is like we're watching this movie. Let's hit pause on our remote. Because here, right, a flash, if you like, of righteousness flickering in Lot's dark life. We need to pause right here and see what Peter saw. Righteous Lot, surrounded by ungodly conduct. And what does Lot do? Lot greets them with dignity. He offers these men what was the standard Eastern cultural practice. He offered them hospitality. But we hear their response in the end of verse 2, don't we? Their response to him offering hospitality is, no, it's okay. We'll spend the night in the open square. Lot's response to what they said in verse 3, and it comes over very clearly in how Moses expresses it, but he, that is Lot, insisted strongly. Lot insisted that they must come to his home. He knew what would happen to those men if they stayed in the town square overnight. "No," he says, "you cannot stay there. You must, I insist, you must come with me to my house." Now it seems at this point that Lot didn't realise that these men were angels, otherwise he wouldn't have been so keen to insist. Lot unwittingly entertained angels. And that is commendable according to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2. We get a flicker, a little flash, as it were, of light coming from Lot in this, and then welcoming these men, these angelic visitors, into his house. According to verse 2, he desires that they would wash those dusty feet. And then he provides for them. And we're told then, what was this provision? In verse 3, they turned into him, they entered his house, and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now this is fascinating. If they're angels, and they ate. Seems he doesn't know that they're angels, so rightly he's offering them food. And they ate. Now if you do know chapter 18, those angels had meal earlier in the day provided by Abraham. And here the meal seems to be more meagre that Lot serves up. The main thing mentioned in relation to the meal is unleavened bread, which of course could be very quickly thrown together. But not only that, I personally suspect that the angels in the whole climate of Lot's home, that is at least compared to Abraham's, where they had just come from. Now, remember, as we've seen this previously in our other studies, Moses is providing a contrast in these passages between Abraham and these chapters. Lot's like the second character. We're just looking at Lot. But there's this contrast by Moses between Abraham and Lot. When we understand that, that is helpful as we go through these passages. It is an interesting study to compare the hospitality that Abraham offered the angels in the opening of chapter 18. Lot offered the angels here in the opening of chapter 19. And strangely enough, when we compare those things, strangely enough, there is no mention of Mrs. Lot and his daughters involved in helping. Whilst Moses is very careful that Abraham's wife and Abraham's servants are involved in serving these men their big feast earlier in the day. Was it that Lot had little respect in his own home? Oh, you invited them in here? You get them the food. Or whatever the difference is, I would submit to you that the angels would have immediately sensed something of the worldly spirit in Lot's home compared to that which they had just come from Abraham's tent. Now, we know that Abraham's home was far from perfect. The previous chapter. And there's something that is warm and personal there. Whereas we're left with the feeling that things are cold and distant in Lot's home. It's like Moses is just not mentioning these others, seemingly in contrast, that here's Lot left to himself to try and enter. Well, nevertheless, Lot does offer hospitality to his guests. And perhaps they finish the meal, they begin to prepare to bed down for the night, but their peace and tranquility inside the house is about to be shattered by what is unfolding outside. Second thing now, the calling voices. Look at verse 4. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house, and they called for Lot. Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally. Outside the front door of Lot's house was this massive mob of men. Now we need to pick up on the repetition here. Moses, did you pick up on that? In verse 4, now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom. Repetition is significant. For the original recipients of Moses' writings here did not have a Bible on their laps like most of you do now. When they first heard this, it was read out to them. It was verbally received through the ear gate. And when something is repeated by Moses, it's done for emphasis. Moses is wanting to emphasize this point of who is outside Lot's house. He are men. And he clarifies who these men are in the second half of verse 4. They are old men who should know better. They are young men who are pursuing their lustful thoughts. And he tells us from where they came from every section, every quarter, every suburb, every lane, every nook, every cranny of that city. From all over the city. All the people. Notice that. All the people from every quarter. Let's think in percentage. This is, at least we could say, a very high who were homosexuals. Actually, I think we're left with the impression, aren't we, that virtually all the men of the city of Sodom, virtually all the men, were homosexuals. Not a small percentage, 1 or 2, 3%, that maybe not 10% that the gay lobby tried to deceive us is the case today. But here in this city, we can at least say it's in the high 90% range. It is repulsive. These grow to these visitors so that they could abuse them sexually. This is what they heard. The calling voices that filtered into Lot's house were calling voices of perverse men, and Moses records their words. Where are those? Bring them out here, because we want to know them carnally. In Mardi Gras atmosphere, the night's party moved to outside Lot's house, because the news, it seemed, had spread through the town that there are strangers in town. Opportunity to satisfy their perverse cravings after defile and sinful lust. This sin was not done in shameful silence. It was open. It was public. As they are surrounding Lot's house, to him inside. Isaiah, speaking about the sins of Jerusalem, in Isaiah 3 verse 19 says, "They declare their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it." That was the reputation of Sodom. And they're not trying to hide their sin. They're blazing, they're open, they're public about their sin. The prophet Zephaniah says, "The perverse knows no shame." And there is no shame outside the door as their calling voices filter into Lot's house. Bold, and they are brazen in their sin. No, friends, our society may not have reached the depths of depravity when it comes to Sodom's percentage of gays. We are living at a time when the gay lobby is becoming bold. They are aggressive in promotion of their perversion, and they are increasingly pursuing it, and they have no shame in their depravity. I have a friend who used to work in the banking industry in the area of Hollywood, and he would regularly in that industry because of his employment. And he has assured me that what he saw firsthand by all those people coming into that bank and opening accounts and closing accounts, that those people who were largely workers in the Hollywood industry, that the vast majority of them, as far as he could determine, from homosexual. They are setting the moral agenda of that influential part of Western culture. Many of the big names, and yes, even the pretty faces, are either homosexual or sexual. It's sickening. Don't be fooled by Hollywood. All that glitters is not gold. And those voices today that come through movies and videos, and those voices, if you like, they're calling outside of the homes of the godly even today. And they want access. They want to come in. They want access to our living rooms. They want access to our minds. They want access to our morals. People. You see, nothing's changed. Rightly, Solomon says, there is nothing new under the sun. Hollywood may seem like a long way away, and it is, in terms of distance. But closer to home. And brazen Sydney Mardi Gras. Maybe you saw this as a news report. The Lord Mayor of Sydney openly welcomed the homosexual community into his city by raising their flag. It's the rainbow flag, if you didn't know. Now, this is the Mayor of Sydney. As Sydney is home to Australia's largest gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender community, and we host the internationally recognised Mardi Gras, we are proud to fly this rainbow flag on our most important town hall. It sends a strong message to our residents, workers and visitors of our unwavering support for the gay community and our recognition of their important contribution to this city. End quote. He did. He opened the door to those perverse calling voices outside. And he said, come into our city. And while you are here, let all your passions run, all your sinful desires, and we welcome you. Coming back to our story, what will Lot do? The tension's rising in this story. Those voices are calling out, what now? Verse 6. So, Lot went out to them through the doorway, shuts the door behind him. Now again, friends, quickly, let's reach for our remote and hit pause right here at this story. Because here's another flash of righteousness. This was a commendable act of courage for this man on the inside to turn the handle of that door, to open the door, and not just peek outside, but to go outside and close the door behind him. See this man, Lot? Standing on his porch, do what he knows is right. He goes to protect his guests inside. Those men who had come under his roof. And in that culture, that clearly meant that it was his responsibility as the head of that home to protect them. And in order to do so, Lot put himself between that crazy mob and his guests. Hit play again on the remote and listen to what he says in verse 7. And he said, please, my brethren, do not do. Please, my brethren. As Lot begins to talk, we get a sense that the courage is compromised by his moral weakness. Please, my brothers. I'm really one of you, my brethren. Please. You see the approach he's trying? He's trying the nice approach. But it just doesn't cut it. You know, if I can just be friendly enough, polite enough, then that will win the day with these people. If they could just be convinced that I'm one of them. I'm one of their brethren, that I actually am, and their culture, and then I'll win them over. But Lot's mushy, sentimental approach of cultural relativism could never work. And it will never work. Of modern evangelicalism has adopted that approach to try and win the world today. If only we can be nice enough. If only we can be friendly enough. Now, I'm not saying we should be grumpy and grouchy. Obviously, I'm not saying that. But they're approach enough, so that'll win them. We just got to identify with their culture, and that'll win the day. Let's try and connect with them emotionally. Our sentimental music will persuade them. That'll win them. It never works. But again, friends, listen to Lot. What's he say? Please, my brethren. That's not all he says. It's a little bit confusing. Please, my brethren, do not do so. Quick, hit the pause again. We've got to stop right here. Because here at least, Lot is calling their conduct wicked. Let's commend him for that. He's not pandering to their debauched behaviour. He's not calling it, it's just you. He's not saying, well, look, we accommodate you because we understand that you have this genetic disposition to this particular way. He knew that this was not a matter of genes. That this was a matter of gross God. In the language of Romans 1, they had left the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful. And Lot, in this flicker of their activity and their desire for what it is, wicked. But Lot's crisis of confusion comes to the fore in verse 8. Hit play again. Let's keep moving. He says in verse 8, "See to have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men." Did you hear what he just said? I am a father, 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please, let me bring my daughters out to you, and I give you the right to do with them whatever you want. How the Father even think such a thing, let alone present it to them as a serious option? How? Lot's former compromises, friends, had moral judgment. He has been influenced by Sodom's values. To hear such a horrible solution to an atrocious problem, rightly we are appalled by this. We're sickened by it. And yet, friends, in the midst of this, let's not miss it. There is another flicker of light. Did you notice how he describes his daughters in verse 8? I have 2 daughters who have not known. Now we should commend Lot the father. He has brought up these 2 daughters who are still virgins, and he's brought them up in this context. Remember, they've been there at least 15 years, but we know it's longer. He's brought them up in a context of sexual immorality. The dad, he's been able to bring them up so that they have not yet known a man. And yet Lot is confused. He has brought himself to a place of total moral confusion. He finds himself and he provides a repulsive solution. He has not lived a life where he has been exercising the muscle of faith. He has faith. We know that. But we see that he has not lived his life expecting, in difficult times, the intervention of God. He doesn't seem here to be factoring in God's intervention in this situation. All that he's trying to do is, if you like, negotiate and broker a deal which he probably thinks, it's good business, man. Lot is not used to doing what is right and leaving the results to God. It almost seems as if he is thinking in his mind, well, it's okay to let these men fulfill their desire. It's their right. Sound familiar? Lot is a weak man who only sees himself as the answer to this crisis. Many years before, Lot entered, and now we are seeing evidence that Sodom has entered Lot. And friends, in the end, Lot brought this problem upon himself. It comes after a pattern of spiraling foolish decisions. He is in this crisis of confusion because he has cultivated a compromised character over a period of years. He has had opportunity to make principled decisions, but he has consistently compromised, got himself into this mess. because he has tolerated the accumulating effect of compromise in his life. The third and final thing, as we bring the story to an end, is the saving hand. Lot's proposal, who he's speaking to outside his house, went down like a proverbial lead balloon. Look at verse 9. This is their response. They said, "Stand back." In other words, get out of our way, buddy. Came in to stay here, to join us here, to sojourn here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. Here is Lot outside the door, and he is getting squashed to death. They're there, the door's there, and he's being pinned to the door. Notice the description. In the end of verse 9, they came near to break down the door. Lot is staring death. He's on the outside of the door. He's in front of the door. There's all this pressure coming towards him, and what's behind him is almost breaking. So guess what's happening to him? These people made it quite clear that they're about to kill him. And they also make it quite clear that they resent him in their city, let alone in their face. Who made you judge over us anyway, pal? We're going to do something worse to you than what we were going to do with them. Lot's in a crisis. His eyes are bulging. How will it end? Verse 10. But the men reached out their hands, a reference to the angels inside. The men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut. They reached out their hand, the saving hand. Those visitors show now they're more than men. How could they, on the inside, open the door inside the house when the door was already about to break in? You see, this is some sort of supernatural act that's happening here. This was the compassion, this was the power, this was the grace of God at work in this situation. And now verse 11 it says, "And they struck the men with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door." They hit them with blindness. But this is interesting, because this blindness is a different blindness that you might automatically think. This blindness that is mentioned here is not the normal Hebrew word for blindness. In only one other place in the Old Testament, and we won't turn there, but you can later if you want. It's in 2 Kings chapter 6 and verse 18. What's this blindness? Well, it's like as if they have been dazzled by a bright light. It's a temporary condition. It's not a mental blindness. It's a mental confusion. And you see there at the end of verse 11, in the end, it's not blindness that caused them to leave their pursuit, is it? It was weariness. They couldn't find the door. They got tired, wearied themselves in their pursuit of perversion. And the crowd disperses. And we have a temporary break in the tension of this story. And that's the place that we'll break off for the day, and Lord willing come back next week to the narrative. See just there at the end, that even the temporary judgment of God did not persuade those men to give up their carnal and sinful lusts. You see that? They still wearied themselves in their sinful desires whilst they were under the judgment of God. In our own day. Romans chapter 1 is plain that the wrath of God is being poured out upon the ungodly now. It's being poured out, as Romans chapter 1 goes on to list, one of the many sins is being poured out on even this perverse sin today. Romans 1:27 says, receiving themselves in the penalty of their error, which was due. So even today, as the wrath of God is being poured out, still the gay lobby, the gay society pursues their perversion, their pursuit of their lusts, even to death, even in the midst of AIDS and so on. Why? Well, Romans 1 tells us, we need to read that passage. Time doesn't allow, but we read that in relation to this. God has given them over to their sin. Now the main lesson I wanted to, in relation to the life of Lot is this. A pattern of compromise will end in a crisis of moral confusion. A pattern of compromise will end in a crisis of moral confusion. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. Don't be deceived. Don't get tricked by this and think it's not this. This is the case. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows. So if a man sows the seeds of compromise in his life, he is going to reap a crisis of confusion sooner or later. Lot's crisis came as a result of years of sowing the seed of compromise. A pattern of compromise. It seemed to limit his own personal expectation of God's intervention in a crisis. Throughout his life, Lot had not developed the muscle of faith to do what is right, whatever that may seem to do, and leave the rest to God to work it out. Lot had capitulated to the value system of Sodom, and he found himself in a state of moral confusion. Try and imagine how his girls thought, what they thought when they say what he did. Lot got himself into such confusion through a series of compromised decisions and circumstances. And friends, may we learn that lesson. May we avoid compromise and live lives of the Word of God. Avoiding compromise, perhaps in the area of finances, in the area of our relationships. Maybe it's in the discipline of the use of our time. Whatever it is. And establishing the biblical practice of principling by the grace of God and the energy of the Spirit that can break the cycle of compromise. Trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and exercise the muscle of faith along the way, friends. So that when the tough times come, we have the strength of faith to respond. To have on our radars, whatever the crisis, that God has the power, He has the grace to... We need not compromise yet again to try and get ourselves out of the jam. May God grant us great measures of His Spirit, that we might stand for Him in our Sodom-like society. That this chapter is full of gross sin. Horrible, hideous sin. But the wonderful thing about the gospel is that it doesn't matter what the sin that we've committed. Blood of Jesus Christ can cleanse us from all sin. In the first century in Corinth, there were members in the church there who had formerly been homosexuals, idolaters, and the list goes on. But homosexuals. And Paul says this of them: such were some of you, but that's what you were. That's what you were. Such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. Well, may the Lord help us that we would have a focus upon Christ and the power of the blood to wash even our grossest sin from our lives. Amen.